Okay.
I'll mute.
Good afternoon. Welcome to everybody attending today. My name is Karen Burkhart. I am the Executive Director of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. We're pleased to welcome you to today's program, Battlegrounds, the Fight to Defend the Free World with General H.R. McMaster. I want to point out a few functions about submitting questions and comments. For those who are here, you may, if you will see the hand function, you may raise your hand and we'll call on you. At the bottom of your screen, you will see that there is a chat function for general comments. Those can be seen by all participants. There is also a Q&A function for submitting written questions. We will be deferring questions until General McMaster's remarks, so please be patient. If you have your hand up, we will get to you. As I'm sure you all are aware, we are honored to be included as one of 78 nonprofit organizations in this year's Indie Give campaign. So today, being Giving Tuesday, I would like to let Carol Campbell with Mad Woman Marketing speak briefly to you about our participation.
Good evening, everyone. As Karen said, it is Giving Tuesday, and while I'm sure your emails inboxes have been crammed with tons of appeals and requests for funding, I'd like to share with you why the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council is most worthy of your consideration. I know you've attended this program, different programs throughout the year. Karen and Jamie have done an incredible job of bringing together a great array of talent this year, you know, in virtual format so that you don't lose out on being able to see this incredible content. Would love you to consider from Indie Give that you might consider what you would have making an investment to the World Affairs Council in the amount you might have spent to attend events this year, and to encourage your friends to come to events, to learn a bit more about the organization, to become members, and to invest, because it really is important content that's important for our local business community, for you as citizens, for the next generation of students. Great organization. Thanks for considering.
Thank you, Carol. Let me just take a moment and thank our supporters. I would like to acknowledge the Tiemens Foundation, Wells Fargo Private Bank, the Richard Petritz Foundation, Mackenzie Place, and also thank you to all of our institutional members. That would include the El Pomar Foundation, Colorado College, the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, Pikes Peak Community College, Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC, SIVA Charter High School, and Fountain Valley School. So with that, I will turn this over to Sky Forrester, our Emeritus Board Member.
All right, thank you, Karen, and it is a great pleasure for me to introduce to you a gentleman I've had the pleasure of knowing off and on for several years in various capacities. Lieutenant General retired H.R. McMaster, whom I'm sure is known to everyone here, became a household name. He was always a household name in the Army, but it became a household name in the country as the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and then still on active duty, which in itself was controversial. That might be a question for later, General. And but served for 34 years before retiring from the Army in June of 2018. From 2014 to 2017, he was the director of the Army Capabilities Integration Center at Army Training and Doctrine Command, where he was directing concepts for the future Army. He was commanding general of the Maneuver Center of Excellence at Fort Benning, overseeing training and education for the Army. He's led soldiers and organizations in wartime, including the Multinational Task Force in Kabul and Afghanistan, 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Iraq, and in Operation Desert Storm as part of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. He's also commanding general out here at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs. He served overseas as an advisor to senior commanders in the Middle East, Iraq, and Afghanistan. As I would argue, just as important as all of that, he was an assistant professor of history at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point from 1994 to 1996, and he's taught at the graduate level at Columbia University and is now at Stanford, a small little place out in California, where he is a lecturer in management as the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institute and a visiting fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Many claims to fame, and one of the ones that I have always loved is that, and I think I'm right in saying this, General, that it was your doctoral thesis, your published book, Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Lies That Led to Vietnam. And everyone listening to this should recognize the irony and the wonderfulness of a junior serving officer writing a book and a doctoral thesis that gets published as a book with a title like that, and then going on to not only survive, but excel as a free thinker in the United States military, which I think in itself is a testament to his intellect and his integrity. And the last thing I'll mention, my introduction, and General McMaster will talk about this as part of his presentation, is his recent book, just published, called Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. I've tossed into the chat to everybody in attendance the link to that on Amazon. I've read the book. It is, well, I'll ask a question about it later, but it is a tour de force. It is not a tell-all about his time in the White House, but there is a lot of candor there. So a lot of what appears in Dereliction of Duty, that same kind of integrity and candor comes through in this book as well. So I look forward to hearing your comments, General McMaster. And with that, I turn the floor over to you, and I will mute myself. But thanks for being here. It's good to have you back.
Hey, Scott, thanks for having me. And it's great to see you. And thanks for your leadership and your example over the years. And Karen, thanks for having me, and World Affairs Council, anybody's in attendance today. I mean, I really had you in mind when I wrote Battlegrounds, because I have this theory, and I hope it pans out, that if we can learn more about the challenges that we're facing, we can come together as Americans, we can reverse some of the polarization we've seen in our society as we emerge from these quadruple crises of a pandemic, a recession associated with a pandemic, the social divisions laid bare by George Floyd's murder and the protests that followed, and concerns over inequality of opportunity associated with that, and unequal treatment under the law, and now this vitriolic political season, which we can't seem to get behind us either. So I really hope that the book generates meaningful discussion about the greatest challenges we face, so we can work together to build a better future for generations to come. And that's the overall purpose of the book. I mean, I state in the preface, this is not the book that most people wanted me to write, including my own family members, certainly my agent and my editor, and maybe writing a tell-all would have been more lucrative, but I just didn't think it would be useful. I just thought, okay, do we really need another tell-all about Donald Trump? What I hope is that the book will transcend that administration, will help us place the challenges we're facing today in a broader historical context as the first step in making a projection into the future and deciding what we need to do to promote peace, to promote our prosperity and our influence in the world. So the book has a theme that runs through it, and the theme is what I call strategic narcissism, and that's our tendency to define the world only in relation to us, and to assume that what we decide to do or decide not to do will be decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. And of course, this is a problem, right? Because such an approach is self-referential, and it neglects the agency, the influence, the authorship over the future that others have. And in the book, I point out that this has become a problem mainly after the end of the Cold War, a period of tremendous optimism, and optimism with justification. And I tell the story in the introduction of patrolling the East-West German border and the West German Czechoslovak border as a captain in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and going from, in November of 1989, one moment staring down East German border guards, to the next moment the gates being thrown open, and then tens, and then hundreds, and then thousands, and then tens of thousands of East Germans flooding across the border, bearing bouquets of flowers and bottles of wine, and there were hugs and tears of joy Of course, after this, the East German government, faded away and the Soviet Union broke apart. We won the Cold War. And then those same cavalry troopers who were patrolling that border just a year later, almost exactly to the day, flew to Saudi Arabia. Remember that Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, and we were there to prepare for the offensive that would return Kuwait to the Kuwaitis. And on the 26th of February 1991, in a battle that was a lopsided victory, in a war that was full of lopsided victories, Eagle Troop, our cavalry troop, destroyed a much larger force and suffered no casualties in that attack against a large defending enemy. And I think it was the combination of victory in the Cold War, that lopsided victory in the Gulf War, that led to a period of confidence that grew into overconfidence and bred complacency. Complacency that was based on three, what are clearly in retrospect, fundamentally flawed assumptions about that post-Cold War era. The first of these is that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. A related assumption that great power competition was a relic of the past. And then a third assumption that our technological military prowess, as we demonstrated in the Gulf War, would ensure that if any foe had the temerity to challenge us, that a future war would be fast, cheap, and efficient, and waged from standoff range. This was an assumption associated with what became an orthodoxy of the revolution in military affairs in the 1990s. And I argue in the book that this was a setup. It was a setup for strategic shocks and disappointments in the 2000s. Of course, foremost among them, the most devastating, the most destructive terrorist attack in history, the attacks of 9/11, in which a brutal, determined terrorist organization used box cutters and airplanes to bypass our technological military advantages. And then the long and the length and cost, the unanticipated length and cost of the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. We often debate, should we have invaded Iraq in 2003? I think it would be more fruitful to debate who the heck thought it would be easy and why did they think it would be easy. And I argue in the book that a short-term approach to these long-term challenges in Afghanistan and Iraq actually lengthened those wars and made them more costly. And then of course we had the 2008 2009 financial crisis, and these shocks and disappointments, they shook our confidence. And it was in this period that the emotional impetus behind our foreign policy shifted, I believe, from overconfidence and a tendency to undervalue the risks and costs of action to pessimism and resignation and a tendency to undervalue the risks and costs of inaction. So if the invasion of Iraq in 2003 typified the former, I would say that the unenforced red line in Syria in 2013 is an example of the latter, or the complete disengagement from Iraq in December of 2011, or using the bombs not boots approach to Libya and doing really nothing to shape the political outcome and the nature of a post-Gaddafi Libya in a conflict that continues to go on. So the book is an argument for a restoration of strategic competence that has been dissipated due in large measure to this tendency towards strategic narcissism and not acknowledging the degree to which the other, our adversaries, rivals, enemies have a say in the future course of events. And the recommendations follow along the theme of strategic empathy, a term I borrowed from the historian Zachary Shore, who argues that we ought to pay attention in particular to the ideology, the emotions and aspirations that drive and constrain others. The book also, in each part of the book, examines how the recent past produced the present as the first step in making a projection into the future. So the topics in the book cover our competition with Russia, Vladimir Putin's Russia, a leader who is driven by a sense of honor lost after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a drive, an emotional a drive and determination to restore Russia to national greatness. Putin's strategy, what I call Putin's playbook in the book, a campaign of disruption, disinformation, and denial, recognizes that that Russia doesn't have they don't have the resources to compete with us directly, certainly from an economic standpoint. Russia's economy is about the size of Texas's economy or Italy's economy. And so what Russia's theory of victory, Putin's theory of victory, is to drag us all down under the theory that Putin can be the last man standing in Europe. And the way he's going to drag us down is through a sustained campaign of disinformation, cyber-enabled information warfare against us in an effort to polarize us, pit us against each other, reduce our confidence in our common identity as Americans and our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. What do we do about that? We have to pull the curtain back on this activity. We have to stop being our own worst enemies, as I think President Trump has been in alleging, widespread fraud, for example, and really playing into the hands of our adversaries in connection with reducing our confidence in our democratic processes and in our election in particular. We also have to do better at imposing costs on Putin that go beyond those that he factors in at the outset of his decision making. I think it's his belief that we're distracted, for example, is one of the reasons why he was so brazenly poisoned his main opponent, political opponent, Navalny, in recent months, and then also has been infiltrating, little green men again back into Belarus in this case, and intensifying actions in Ukraine and so forth. So I think that the important aspect of this to remember is that we have to compete. We have to return to arenas of competition that we vacated based on these flawed assumptions about the nature of the world. The chapters on China describe China's efforts to the Chinese Communist Party's efforts based on fear of losing the party's exclusive grip on power, and aspiration to create exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region and to challenge the United States globally to affect what Xi Jinping has called national rejuvenation and China taking center stage in the world. It's important for us to compete effectively with China's campaign, a campaign I describe as one of co-option, coercion, and concealment, and I'd be happy to talk much more about that as well. The other parts of the book deal with the problem of jihadist terrorist organizations, a threat that I believe is actually greater now than it was on September 10th, 2001. We could talk more about that. I think it's greater now in part because these organizations have not given up their efforts to not only establish caliphates in the region, but to continue to commit mass murder against innocents as a principal tactic in a war against all humanity. And these groups also are much more capable because of the size of them. The alumni of these groups, Al Qaeda and ISIS and Lashkar-e-Taiba, al-Nusra, is orders of magnitude larger than the Mujahideen era alumni of the resistance to Soviet occupation in Afghanistan, and they're pursuing really the more and more destructive capabilities previously associated only with nation states. And then chapters also deal with the hostile states of Iran and North Korea, as well as the complex problem sets, interconnected problem sets of climate and environment and energy and food and water and health security. And in each of the chapters, I look at the assumptions that underpin previous efforts to overcome these challenges, and then recommend a new set of assumptions on which to base our policies and a new set of actions that will help build a better future for generations to come. So I would love to hear where we'd like to take the conversation. I could talk about any of those issues in greater detail, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have one participant who's raised a hand. Would you like to, Charles O'Brien, would you like to ask your question live? Not sure where you went. No, I guess not. Hand down. Okay. Well, first question from Paul. Are we getting any benefits such as a peace dividend with our vast Navy spread out throughout the world? Same question for Air Force and Army units.
Well, yeah, it's hard to prove a negative, but forward position capable joint forces, right? Navy, Army, Air Force, forces really help prevent war because they are immensely important to deterring our adversaries by denial, which really means, convincing potential enemies that they can't accomplish their objectives through the use of force. I would say that our forward position forces have been critical to preventing great power conflict for over 75 years now. And while it's difficult to prove a negative, I think there are cases that do prove the importance of forward position capable forces. I mean, it's not a coincidence, for example, that the last U.S. soldier who had remained on the Korean Peninsula after World War II, that the last soldier departed in March of 1950, and North Korea invaded in June of 1950. For example. And of course, our forward position forces also prevent our adversaries from intimidating other countries in the region. It's important to note that not only China is not only attempting to affect the largest land grab, so to speak, in history in the South China Sea, but is also engaged in, I think, the largest peacetime buildup in history, increasing defense spending by over 800% since the mid 1990s. This is meant to intimidate countries in the region, to create servile relationships through intimidation, military intimidation, but also economic forms of aggression, and to exclude the United States from these areas. Now, why is that important? Well, heck, 1/3 of the world's surface trade travels through the South China Sea. And so without access to that, with China in control of that would put us at a tremendous disadvantage economically. But then also from a military perspective, China is, with these long-range missile capabilities they've been developing, these shore-to-ship missile capabilities, in particular long-range missiles, they've been trying to create this anti-access area denial bubbles from Northeast Asia to centered around Taiwan and the South China Sea and so forth. Russia is doing the same with its missile and air defense capabilities from the Arctic to the Baltic to the Black Sea to Syria and to Northern Africa. Well, if you have forward position capable joint forces, you automatically turn that what would be denied space potentially to contested space, and you don't have to fight your way back in. I think it's important to remember the historical example of the Japanese centripetal offensive in 1941 that was launched concurrent with the attacks on Pearl Harbor and our base bases in the Philippines. And this offensive was mainly a land offensive, meant to gain control of the inter-island chain, and then create a situation in which it was just too costly. It was just too costly for Americans to penetrate that island chain and threaten Japan directly. The Japanese leadership assumed that America didn't have the will to make those sacrifices. Of course, they were wrong. But if you think about what China's trying to do today, it's something quite similar in terms of you're creating an exclusionary area of primacy that it'll be impossible for us to operate in, and then to use that coercive power that they gain by excluding us to create servile relationships with countries in the region. And if China succeeds, the world will be less free, less prosperous, and less safe. So I think it's not that we need to have soldiers positioned overseas on the scale which they've been positioned over since the end of the Cold War, but it's worth noting that the size of our forces that are deployed overseas today is the lowest that it's been since before World War II.
Okay, related to that, there is a question on the chat that asks, how many U.S. troops should remain in Afghanistan and for how long?
I think the number doesn't matter. It's really the capability. And we've been in this habit, in recent decades even, or maybe at least the last 10 years, of talking about troop numbers. Like, that's what matters. I think what's really important is that we have sufficient military capability there to enable the Afghans to bear the brunt of the fight against these enemies of all humanity. It's worth pointing out, certainly, that we only had 8,500 there, as the planned number. And now these other numbers that are thrown around are just arbitrary, and they actually lead to counterproductive behavior and really an inability to accomplish the mission. Now, we don't need 122,000 troops there, which is what we had at the peak. 8,500 is a minuscule number of troops. And what's important is that although we've had 10 of our soldiers make the ultimate sacrifice in combat in Afghanistan this year, about 30 Afghan soldiers and police give their lives every day to protect the freedoms that they've enjoyed since 2001. And I think it's worth supporting them. I think it's also worth pointing out that the 8,500 number of troops there in Afghanistan was lower than the number of the rest of the coalition troops that were provided there. So, there was a high degree of burden sharing. The cost of that commitment had gone down from, again, probably about $120 billion a year to about, the forecast was down to $7.5 billion, which was sustainable, and a level at which I think we can think of it as an insurance policy. And to recognize that, hey, I think the whole narrative on Afghanistan has been wrong. I really think we won already and just didn't acknowledge it. We expected Afghanistan to become Denmark, but Afghanistan doesn't need to be Denmark. It just needs to be Afghanistan. And a sustained commitment over time from us would enable us to have not only the security capability there to help Afghanistan strengthen itself against the regenerative capacity of the Taliban, which lies across the border in Pakistan, but it would also give us the influence to convince Pakistan to stop its support for the Taliban and other groups by saying, hey, we're not going anywhere, and we're not going to give you anything, and we're going to help you along your path to pariah state, along the model of North Korea, if you continue to support these jihadist terrorists who are a threat to all civilized people. I mean, I don't think Pakistan wants to be a pariah state with China as its only state sponsor, but I think we ought to force them to make that choice if they're going to continue to support terrorist organizations that are a threat to us, and obviously a more proximate threat to Afghanistan and to India as well.
All right, thank you. I have a question from Bear McConnell. Any comment on the Bolton book?
No, not really. I mean, I haven't read it. I mean, I read parts of it, but yeah, I mean, no comment. I mean, the only thing I'll say is that I just can only talk about why I didn't write that kind of book. First of all, I just didn't think it would be as useful as writing really an assessment of our foreign policy since the end of the Cold War across multiple administrations, and a book that aims to recommend what we have to do from a nonpartisan and non-personalized perspective. In my book, I'm very critical of Trump administration policies, but I think it's important that a national security advisor, not violate the confidence of the president, especially during that president's term, that same term. And the reason for this is the national security advisor position is unique in that you're the only person in the foreign policy establishment who has the president as his or her only client. And if you are able, to give the president the benefit of best advice across the departments and agencies, and to assist with the effective implementation of the president's decisions and policies, you have to be in a position of trust. And what I was concerned about is obviously if I would violate that trust, especially having served as an active duty officer in that position, that it would have maybe placed that trust in jeopardy for future presidents in connection with their relationship with future national security advisors as well.
Thank you. Next question. What, in your opinion, could lead us into a war in light of the recent assassination of Iran's lead nuclear scientist?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that Iran has been waging a proxy war against us for 4 decades, right? So us being the great state in the United States, the little state in Israel, to the Arab monarchies, and more broadly, the West, right? And so what are some of the landmarks in that 4-decade-long proxy war? Well, it's obviously the taking of 77 hostages in 1979. It is the multiple kidnappings between 79 and into the 80s, mainly in Lebanon. It is the bombing of our embassy and the bombing of a Marine barracks with devastating effects and loss of hundreds of Americans in Lebanon in 1983. It is the tanker war from 80 to 88, and the damaging with mines of our naval vessels in the Gulf. Gosh, it is really Hezbollah and the RGC going global with terrorist attacks in Europe, Argentina, Panama in the 1990s. It's the Khobar Towers bombing in 96. I could just go on, right? It's a killing of through proxies of over 600 Americans in Iraq during the Iraq War. So, that sounds like a proxy war and the escalation of which in these events were completely in the hands of the Iranians, who believed with good measure, I mean, with good reason, that they could escalate that war whenever they wanted with impunity, because we never seemed to get, hey, what the return address was for these kinds of attacks until the killing of Qasem Soleimani, for example, which I think began to restore a degree of deterrence. So I think it's important to view any actions against Iran, any incident, in context of the 4-decade-long proxy war, what is proven to be the regime's permanent hostility to the United States, Israel, and the Arab monarchies in particular, but I would say also Europe as well, unless except for when they think they can get something out of the Europeans. And I think it's also important to place this, anything that occurs in context of, of the ideology, of the regime that drives its behavior. Now, this assassination seems to be an effort to block Iran's path to a nuclear weapon. Again, it's not a novel incident, right? There have been assassinations of Iranian scientists as part of a broader campaign that also appear to include cyber attacks as well against Iranian nuclear missile facilities. So, I mean, that's what this is about. I think is to block Iran's path to a nuclear weapon. A program which Iran says, well, it never had, but also continues to threaten to restart its nuclear weapons program. Again, the program that it says it never had. So, I just think this is not a regime to be trusted. And I think that Israel, if it is Israel behind this attack, is this attack is part of an implementation of the Begin Doctrine, which means that Israel will not allow a hostile regime to get access to the most destructive weapons on earth. And of course, this is what led to the strike against the Iranian nuclear facility. I mean, the Iraqi nuclear facility in 1981, to the Syrian nuclear weapons facility in 2007, and so I think this is part of what seems to be a sustained campaign.
So a related question from Dr. Cohen. Do you think that sooner or later Israel and Iran will go to war? If not, can we get to the point where Iran can be motivated to stop their nuclear activities?
Well, I think that's what the strategy is now. And I think it's the right strategy, which is to force Iran to make a choice, right? I mean, you can't, Iran shouldn't be able to have it both ways. And this is what I cover this in greater detail in Battlegrounds. But really the flaw in our policy, I think, over the many administrations has been really essentially a conciliatory approach to the regime under the belief that there was still a contest going on between the revolutionaries and Republicans within the regime. And that if we took a conciliatory approach, the Republicans would prevail over the revolutionaries and there'd be a fundamental change of heart in the regime. But whereas there have been different contests between the Republicans and revolutionaries, I think it's pretty clear that the revolutionaries have won. And whereas the regime will put forward at times, the shop window of Zarif, their foreign minister, or Rouhani, the president, the real power is Khamenei, the supreme leader, the Guardian Council, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. The sooner we recognize that, the better. And I think our policy ought to be one to force the regime to make a choice of either being treated like a responsible member of the international community, or to be treated like the terrorist sponsor state that it is. And I think ultimately it will be obviously the Iranian people who determine the nature of their government, but our policies ought to support over time, a transition to a regime that ceases its permanent hostility toward us. And if we take a conciliatory approach again, if we go again, I think for sanctions relief under the belief that they'll become like the Grinch at Christmas, their hearts will grow 2 sizes bigger, and the supreme leader will stop the proxy war. I think that's just a pipe dream. And I hope that the Biden administration sees how its conciliatory approach to Iran, associated with the Iran nuclear deal, was a failure, because Iran took all those payoffs and applied them to an intensification of the proxy war against us, Israel, and a perpetuation of state weakness in Arab states, and a continuation of the sectarian civil war in the region.
Thank you. Next question. Is Vladimir Putin ill? And is he grooming his daughter to replace him? And what would that look like? And how would it change our relations with the Russians?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a stretch for him, right? Because, Putin is in power because he's at the top of essentially a protection racket, right? He has dirt on everybody, and they are all interested in not taking each other out, so he's really at the top of that protection racket. In exchange for impunity, in exchange for these oligarchs' freedom of action, they give him a cut of the action, and this is why he's one of the richest people in the world. I think we should do more to publicize that. But his system is basically based on IOUs and handshake deals, right? And once he's out of power, are they going to make good on all that? I mean, I'm not sure. I don't think he's sure, which is why he's modified the Constitution to stay in power until at least 2036. Will the Russian people stomach him till 2036? In what was supposed to be a big year of celebration and great success for him, right? So 75th anniversary of the great end of the Great Patriotic War, the rewrite of the Constitution, him in power until 2036. Well, what happened? COVID, collapse of oil prices, and already he was under pressure domestically because of his effort to rig municipal elections and the backlash against that. Seen the protests in the eastern part of the country associated with dissatisfaction with his removal of a popular provincial official. So, I mean, I just think, I don't think it looks very stable from my perspective in terms of Putin's power. And what we ought to be doing, I think, is cultivating relationships outside of Putin's inner circle, and maximizing positive business relationships and people-to-people relationships and academic exchanges, to play kind of a longer game and to help convince key Russian leaders who might emerge in a post-Putin era that their future lies with the West and with Europe, rather than with East and with the Chinese Communist Party.
All right. Defining success has been elusive. How should we approach the continuing and increasingly arming of the Middle East, in which we are clearly complicit? An atomic Iran? Do you seriously think they might use this weapon offensively? Then there is North Korea and possible economic collapse. Their recourse?
Well, I think on Iran, as I mentioned, I think it's the real answer is to constrain the resources to the regime and its ability to continue its proxy war, and then to play a longer game to convince Iranian leaders who might emerge over time that they're better off as a member of the international community rather than as a pariah state. On North Korea, the chapters I write about North Korea, I talk about really the flawed assumptions that underpin previous policies. The assumption, first of all, that the North Korean regime was untenable, right? That it was just on the verge of collapse at any moment. That might be the case. I mean, North Korea is in a pretty dire situation these days. This is the idea that North Korea is an impossible state. Great, North Korean expert Victor Cha's titled one of his books. And then the other extreme is that if we open up to North Korea, right? If we alleviate sanctions, if we have the sunshine policy under President Moon, which some call it his affinity for a sunshine policy too, or a moonshine policy, that North Korea will see the benefits, right, of opening up and no longer being a hermit kingdom, and therefore will begin to liberalize and become a responsible state. Well, I mean, the problem with that is that it again divorces the North Korea problem from the ideology that drives the Kim family regime. I mean, this is the only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world, right? And Kim Jong-un doesn't want to be the one who gave it up in the third generation. And so he is mainly driven by his effort to maintain the Kim family's iron grip on power in the North, and I think also he is driven by an aspect of this ideology, which is to unify the peninsula, quote, under the red banner. And I believe that he wants a nuclear weapon not for defensive purposes, but wants a nuclear weapon for extortion, to drive the U.S. off the peninsula as the first step in unification. And so I think also what's important about the North Korea and Iran both is what happens to the non-proliferation regime if they get nuclear weapons. How long before Saudi Arabia buys a weapon? Before Japan has a serious conversation about at least a threshold capability? How about South Korea? Like, who gets it next, I think is important. And then in North Korea's case, I mean, North Korea's never met a weapon it didn't try to sell to somebody, including its nuclear weapons program, by the way, to Syria, until the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, bombed that facility in 2007. So the chapter on North Korea, the second chapter on North Korea, each chapter, there's a chapter that sets up the challenge and gives the history of it, describes the so what, why do we care about it, what's at stake. And the second chapter is generally about what do we do about it. The title of that chapter is Making Him Safer Without Them. And I think that the strategy of maximum pressure, which has not really been fully implemented, has never been fully implemented against North Korea, ought to at least allow us to test the thesis that Kim Jong-un can be convinced that his regime is safer without the weapons than he is with them. And I think that's the appropriate approach to North Korea.
Thank you. With our country so divided politically and the media playing on those divisions, how do you propose that we defend against Putin's efforts to bring us down to the lowest ethical and moral levels?
Yeah, well, I think the first step is don't be our own worst enemy, and to do that, we have to demand more from our political leaders. When our political leaders compromise our principles and our confidence in our democratic processes and institutions to score partisan political points, we ought to hold them accountable for it. And that's whether that's President Trump with these claims of massive fraud in our election or massive cyber attacks or electronic changing of votes. It's all, there's no basis for that, in fact, and we should know that because his administration helped put in a lot of the safeguards, and did actually a very good job in safeguarding the election. Or in 2016, when the resist movement and the anti-Trump movement claimed that the Russians determined the outcome of the election. I think we have to just stop. You have to start being smarter about this and recognize that Russia, I don't think, cares who wins the election. I think that they've realized it's beyond the scope of their capabilities to determine the outcome. But what they really want to achieve is they want vast numbers of Americans, the most number of Americans possible, to doubt the legitimacy of the outcome. And then to use those doubts along with their efforts to divide us further on issues of race or on policy issues like immigration or gun control, that we ought to stop being our own worst enemy about it. We ought to have civil, meaningful discussions like you foster in World Affairs Council events about our greatest challenges, and then maybe prioritize discussions about, based on what we agree on first, at least as a basis for common action. I think all of us have a role in doing that. And of course, Russia doesn't create these divisions in our society, but they're very good at exploiting them. And we've been our own worst enemy. I think the other aspect of this has to do with reform of the media. I mean, I think that if anything, the election should have maybe, removed any doubt about media bias, as other actions like the insisting on a sort of an ideological orthodoxy within the New York Times, for example, or the fact that Americans who lean one way politically watch one cable news station. If they lean the other way politically, they watch one of two other cable news stations. The effect that has really on us, in which we don't have an authoritative source of information we all go to, and that's of course exacerbated by social media. And I write about this in Battlegrounds as well, and how these algorithms pull us apart from each other based on more clicks and more advertising money and showing us more and more extreme content. And then the pseudo media in which these crazy conspiracy theories thrive as well. So I think we have a lot of work to do in the information space, and we have a lot to do in terms of demanding more from our leaders, so that they don't compromise our principles, and they emphasize our common identity as Americans and our ability to work together to build a better future for generations of Americans to come.
All right, thank you. Next question. Your metaphor of quote unquote battlegrounds evokes images of a place that promises a culmination, but you are clearly concerned with a conflict environment that is multi-layered and continuous. How do you envision it ever being possible for elected civilian and uniformed leaders to do a better job at envisioning success and achieving it over time when our society and our political discourse seems ever more reduced to tweets and electoral sound bites?
Yeah. Well, it's very important that we come together for sustained discussions, meaningful discussions about these complex problems, that we apply design thinking. We try to understand these problems on their own terms. We view them through the lens of our vital interests, so we can answer the so what problem. Why do we care about this? What's in it for us? And what is of consequence for future generations of Americans? And then really, it's, you allude to it in the question, right? These battles or competitions aren't ever decided by one element of national power. It has to be all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners, allies in particular, working together in an integrated fashion to overcome them. This is what I recommend in terms of regaining our strategic competence throughout the book. And I think the first step is to recognize it is a competition, right? I think that what we have a tendency toward, and this is an element of strategic narcissism that I describe in the book, is a tendency to attribute of all the ills of the world to us, even the actions of our enemies. And you hear this now, I think, in this kind of so-called realist school, which is really an ideological school of thought, in which our disengagement from the world is viewed as an unmitigated good. And this is where kind of the libertarian, or maybe the right wing neo-isolationists meet the new left and the left-wing isolationists. I think that one of the reasons for this is a fundamental misunderstanding of history, and history as it's been taught by what was the revisionist school of history associated with the new left interpretation, right? That all of the ills of the world prior to 1945 are due to colonialism. All the ills of the world after 1945 are due to us and capitalist imperialism. And so this attributes Putin's aggressive actions, to us, and the expansion of NATO or the European Union. It attributes China's aggressive actions, to us, and maybe how mean Donald Trump is. Okay, well, I mean, mean Donald Trump didn't make the Chinese Communist Party foist the COVID-19 virus on the world, to punish the doctors who were trying to raise the alarm bells, to add insult to injury with wolf warrior diplomacy, to bludgeon Indian soldiers on the Himalayan frontier, to extend the party's arm of repression into Hong Kong, to put 1.5 million people in concentration camps, and reduce Uyghur birth rates by 60% in a campaign of cultural genocide, to lay claim to the entire South China Sea, to threaten Taiwan. Okay, let's stop it, to do massive cyber attacks on Australia, and take on really a form of unprecedented economic aggression against Australia in recent weeks. I mean, Donald Trump didn't make them do all of that, right? We didn't cause jihadist terrorism, but I think that what we teach in many history courses is essentially a curriculum of self-loathing, and whereas you don't want to replace that with a happy, contrived view of our history, we want to remain critical of our shortcomings. We should be able to celebrate the great success of the American Revolution and the radical idea that sovereignty lies neither with king or parliament but with the people, and then recognize the tremendous disappointment of not resolving the greatest blight on our history, the institution of slavery, until almost 100 years later. But we ought to be able to celebrate, though, the emancipation of 4 million of our fellow Americans in our bloodiest war in history, while still acknowledging the failure of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow and separate but equal, but then also celebrate the civil rights movement and the achievements of that movement, and the dismantlement of de jure segregation and inequality of opportunity, while recognizing we still have de facto segregation and inequality of opportunity, but that's something we can work on. So I just think a lot of the lack of confidence on our part has to do with a fundamental misunderstanding of history, and in particular, kind of this mild form of self-loathing that cuts across our curricula in academia and in secondary education and primary education even as well.
Thank you. You mentioned the disinformation campaign by Russia. We seem to have an epistemic crisis of our own, i.e. disagreement over the guidelines for sifting through claims and separating quote-unquote truth from quote-unquote falsehoods. I'm thinking here especially of QAnon and the rise of Newscom, etc. How can we have conversations when we don't agree over the means for deriving reliable knowledge? Do you agree? And if so, how do you see a way out of this?
Yeah, I think the way out's education. I really do. And I think that the greatest strength of our nation is an educated populace. I use that line in the book, quoting again my friend and historian Zachary Shore, a brilliant historian. Um, and I think that it has a lot to do with 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 our communities as well, and our ability to come together as Americans for meaningful discussions to reverse this polarization. I think we all have a role in doing that. I believe that one of our greatest dangers is what we might call the end of empathy. Our inability to empathize with one another and have respectful, meaningful discussions about the challenges that we're facing. So I think it's education, and I think it's reestablishing a sense of community. I mean, we're better connected with each other than ever electronically, but more distant from one another, I think, emotionally and psychologically. And I think all of us have a role in addressing that aspect of the problem.
Thank you. This question is from our board president, Carl Schneider. General McMaster, I was in 10th Special Forces Group when you were at 3rd ACR. Nice to see you and thank you for joining us. I hope to get back to you in person. So, regarding our friends the Turks, do you have any concerns vis-a-vis the conflict with Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia?
Well, thanks. And it was great to be with you guys at Fort Carson and in Iraq as well. The old Mike Repass days, as I recall. Whose house I walked into one time. So all those houses looked alike, and man, I was exhausted. We were getting ready to go to Iraq. It was very fast paced. And parked my car on the drive. I walk into the house, and it's Mike Repass and his family sitting at their dinner table at the house next door to me. But hey, I have fond memories of the 10th group, and have worked together with those awesome teams in Iraq and elsewhere. So hey, I think this is the biggest strategic shift since the end of the Cold War. Turkey is, and it's against us. It's in a negative direction, and it's largely, I think, because of Erdogan and the AKP and the way that Erdogan masterfully seized power in the country through democratic process, and then consolidated power through a profoundly undemocratic process, and essentially purged institutions of anyone who could be deemed as disloyal to him. This includes education, schools, secondary schools, primary schools, then universities. It includes the police force, and then the judiciary. It includes the military now after the failed coup attempt, and it includes the media. And the AKP is driven by an ideology. It's a nationalist, but it's also an Islamist ideology associated with the Naqshbandi Sufi order that has features that are in common with Salafi jihadist ideology that lays the basis for terrorist organizations. The Turks are involved under Erdogan in proselytizing this kind of extremist ideology, this extreme version of Islam. They're doing it with Qatari's money and some of their own money in madrasas and mosques, globally, but focused in the Balkans in a way that's particular and short-term concern. The Turks are also becoming much more aggressive in using proxies throughout the region. We saw it recently in Nagorno-Karabakh on the side of the Azerbaijanis and the Islamist militias that they have employed with them. We also see it in Idlib province in Syria, and as far away as in Libya. This is combined with their aggressive actions in the Eastern Mediterranean. And you think, what are they doing? Well, I mean, I think he thinks of himself as a kind of a new sultan, and wants to restore the grandeur of the Ottoman Empire. I think if you doubt that, just look at the palace he built for himself, and that gives you a sense of his own self-importance and what he's trying to do. The way that he's going about it is to straddle both worlds, to straddle Europe. You still have 80% of Turkish trade, by the way, is with Europe. So he's kind of cutting his own throat here in many ways. But then also to lean toward Russia whenever he sees it as advantage to do so. This is why he's buying S-400 missiles from Russia, for example. So I think that, again, with Turkey, it is to play a longer game, to establish positive relationships with the business sector there, as well as other institutions and civil society. The AKP is not monolithic or homogeneous. It's fragmented internally, and it doesn't have maybe a permanent grip on power. Elections still matter in Turkey. This is why he tried to rig the municipal elections last year by calling a revote that worked out to his disbenefit. But what I'm most concerned about with Turkey is now how the population is fed a steady diet through the state-controlled media of anti-Western, anti-US propaganda, and this is a NATO ally. And as you know, this can have a long-term effect on a population. And so I think it's a cause for concern. I lay out what we ought to do about it a little bit in the book, but I think it's mainly maximizing those positive contacts, playing a long game, and seeing what happens to the AKP and to Turkish political leadership in a post-Erdogan era.
Thank you. From what you know of them, how parallel to your views are the pending appointments by the incoming administration?
Well, you know, I really think foreign policy, and one of the reasons I wrote the book is an area that ought to bring us together, right? I mean, who wants North Korea with a nuclear weapon, right? I mean, who wants jihadist terrorist organizations to gain the strength and the capabilities necessary to commit another 9/11 type attack against us, right? We ought to be able to come together around these issues. Who wants China to gain a position of preponderant advantage that disadvantages future generations of Americans? You know, who wants Russia to be able to drag us down? I mean, So I think that these are areas that we could come together on, and I hope that the new administration will resist the temptation to define its foreign policy mainly as in opposition to the Trump administration's foreign policy. I think if they resist that temptation, they should have a foreign policy that emphasizes continuity with the China policy, as well as with the Iran policy, although that's going to be a stretch because of their nostalgia for the Iran nuclear deal, which I think would be a huge mistake to try to turn the clock back to 2016 on that. And I think paradoxically, the areas that the Trump administration's foreign policy has been most efficient are those in which the Trump administration doubled down, I think, on the flaws of the Obama administration's foreign policy. Will they be able to reject what their position was during the Obama administration's foreign policy and learn from those mistakes and errors? I hope so. I mean, they're good people. I want them to succeed, and I think that we ought to give them our support and wait to see what direction they take it in. I do think it's a cause for concern that they've been reticent about appointing Michelle Flournoy, who I don't want to damage her chances further by endorsing her as Secretary of Defense. Hey, but I think she'd be great. I think she'd be great, and she's just so knowledgeable about these problem sets and about the department and the reforms that are necessary within the department as well. So we'll see that that's going to be a big nomination. There'll be an indication. I think that Tony Blinken is an extremely smart and knowledgeable person. I disagreed with him fundamentally on Middle Eastern issues in particular, on Iran issues in particular. But I think he's open to reassessing all these problems, and I hope that he'll set a good course for foreign policy as Secretary of State as well.
Thank you. So I have a question followed up by a follow-up question from John LeMay, so I'm going to just go to both of those. Sir, what do you recommend as the way forward in Afghanistan? And then in parentheses, what capabilities does the U.S. need to maintain there? You mentioned that today the terrorist threat is greater. With ungoverned spaces available in Syria, Libya, Mali, Somalia, and many, many other countries for terrorists to thrive in, how does an outsized investment in Afghanistan further U.S. security, or is it just sunk cost bias? And then that is followed up by the question, what did you mean by, quote, we won already but didn't acknowledge it, unquote, when you answered the last question on Afghanistan?
Well, there's been a narrative defeat about Afghanistan, or there's also been a narrative about this outsized commitment. Now, outsized commitment of 8,500 troops. I mean, gosh, that's an outsized commitment for maybe the Ecuadorian army, but not the United States Army, certainly by historical standards. And neither is the financial commitment exorbitant. And there's been a great deal of burden sharing, increased burden sharing associated with it. So we talked ourselves into defeat in Afghanistan, I believe. And I don't think it's outsized, right? I mean, this is a terrorist ecosystem that exists along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border with over 20 designated terrorist organizations, U.S. designated terrorist organizations. It's not a theoretical case. I mean, 9/11 shows it's not theoretical, but so does the Times Square bomber, who would have maybe been effective in Times Square if he wasn't dodging, U.S. Special Operations Forces and intelligence agency capabilities in the border region, such that he was not properly trained to carry off that bombing. There are many, many other examples of foiled external attacks against us and others because of our capability in Afghanistan. The other thing about it is, I mean, there is no such thing as an over-the-horizon counterterrorist capability, especially if there are conditions set for terrorist organizations to take over, as you allude to, large areas and critical territory and populations. In this case, also access to the narcotics trade, which would put billions of dollars in the pockets of terrorist organizations who are already a danger to us. So there's an important argument to be made that we shouldn't go back to the Bill Clinton counterterrorism strategy, in which, after the first World Trade bombing occurred, the truck bombs in the early 90s, and Al Qaeda declared war on us and then bombed our embassies in Africa. In 1998, we shot a few cruise missiles over the horizon and called it a day. I mean, how did that work out on 9/11? We don't want to go back to that, I don't think. And I think we don't need Afghanistan, as I mentioned, to be Denmark. I mean, it just needs to be Afghanistan. And I don't think it's an outsized commitment. Whatever X number of troops are. I mean, we're at a very low number compared to where we've been in the past. But of course, to sustain that level of commitment in a democracy, you need the American people to recognize what's at stake. Our leaders have failed. I don't blame those who make the argument for disengagement, because our leaders in multiple administrations haven't described, okay, what is at stake, and what is a strategy that will deliver an outcome, the favorable outcome at an acceptable cost. I believe when President Trump gave the August 2017 speech on South Asia, it was the first time that we had a policy in place, a strategy in place that was sensible and sustainable, right, and reasoned. But obviously we abandoned that strategy, I would argue, prematurely.
Are we kidding ourselves that the Afghans can really pick up the task with or without our support?
Not because they weren't doing it. I mean, they were doing it. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't, again, Denmark, but they were doing it. I mean, 30 Afghan soldiers and policemen, dying every day is a significant sacrifice. Not that that's the metric you want to perpetuate, but a lot of those casualties these days are due to the fact that we declared the Taliban no longer an enemy, and we're not actively assisting the Afghan government in targeting and going after the Taliban forces before they can marshal and conduct major attacks against the Afghan people, really. So, I think it was a narrative of self-defeat, and also I think we have to recognize that war is a contest of wills, right? I mean, we neglect continuities in war, in war at our own peril. I read about this in the conclusion, and we've emboldened the Taliban psychologically. If the Taliban raises the black flag over Kabul, what do you think that's going to do for our efforts against jihadist terrorist organizations? It'll be very much the same effect as al-Baghdadi walking up the steps in the mosque in Mosul, right? It'll signal a victory around which others will rally and recruiting numbers will go up. Over 30,000 fighters recruited to ISIS immediately after the fall of Mosul. Hey, I think that's what we're in for, because we haven't sustained. If we don't sustain, the support for the Afghan government and security forces.
How should the U.S. counter the CCP's coercive and predatory engagements throughout the Indo-Pacific region specifically and along the Belt and Road generally? Should it be addressed with military, diplomatic, or whole of government approach?
Yeah, it's definitely whole of government, and a lot of it is economic and diplomatic. I think a lot of the effort that's going on already is extremely positive, promoting, for example, standards for transparency in infrastructure investment in the region. Japan's taken the lead on that. We've joined them in that effort. I think it's important to strengthen democratic institutions. In Battlegrounds, this chapter is entitled "Turning Weakness into Strength," turning what the Chinese view as weaknesses into our greatest strength. Well, what do they view as a weakness? Well, if people have a say in how they're governed, they think that's a weakness. So we should strengthen, I think, representative government when there are those partners to work with who want to strengthen representative government. What else do they fear? They fear freedom of speech, right? When a general manager of an NBA team tweets support for for those in Hong Kong, the Communist Party is pretty touchy about that, right? Or about any kind of form of opposition to Xi Jinping, who just threw, for example, one of his critics in jail for 18 years without any kind of due process. So we ought to promote freedom of speech. It's actually been freedom of the press that has been so powerful in countering China's campaign of co-option, coercion, and concealment. From John Garneau's landmark investigative report in Australia to the press exposure of Chinese complicity in the 1MDB scandal in Malaysia, or the exposure of multi-generations of indebtedness based on Chinese Communist Party loans beyond those which countries can service so they can gain trade debt for equity and take control of infrastructure as they did in Sri Lanka, or as what happened in Ecuador, for example, and resulted in a change of leadership. They fear rule of law, because if you have rule of law, you can't toss 1.5 million people into concentration camps without due process. So we ought to help strengthen rule of law. So I think we ought to be confident in our system, but not be complacent. Strengthen our institutions and our processes. And then we also have to defend, of course, against sustained aggression, especially industrial espionage and various forms of economic aggression as well, through scrutiny of Chinese investments in the United States, as well as the U.S. underwriting of China's China's campaign against us, which we've done after they opened their financial sector in particular. So. And with investments in state-owned enterprises that have to do with the People's Liberation Army's capabilities. I mean, we ought to just stop being complacent about it, compete more effectively. But I think the way to think about it is turning what the party views as weaknesses into our greatest competitive advantages.
Our next question. It feels miraculous to me that we have not stumbled into a major military or armed conflict during the Trump administration. Why was that? Was there something about Trump and who he is that enabled us to avoid that, or was it just luck?
Well, I mean, it's just, of course, wars choose you. It's not like you make the choice. I mean, you can choose to go to war, as in Iraq in 2003. But sometimes wars choose you, as the mass murder attacks of 9/11 showed us, right? So part of it, I think, is actively deterring adversaries, showing not only the capabilities to prevent the accomplishment of objectives through the use of force, but also the will, when necessary, to use force if necessary. And so it's hard to prove a negative. What did a strong forward presence across the Indo-Pacific, what did that prevent from happening? What did the sale and provision of defensive capabilities to the Ukrainian army have in connection with Russia's design maybe to expand its offensive in Ukraine beyond eastern Ukraine? It's really difficult to tell. I do think, though, when you fail to act, like the unenforced red line in Syria, you can see what happens oftentimes. What followed that in 2013 was Russian intervention in Syria. And I believe also you can draw a direct line between that unenforced red line and the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine, as well as the intensification of island building and weaponization of those islands in the South China Sea. Part of the belief that at that time, the Obama administration would not act against even the most brazen aggression. So, it's a calculation, I guess, that is difficult to see in real time, but oftentimes you can see, the effect in retrospect.
All right, thank you. What specific actions do you think that President Biden should take right away to begin to repair relations with friends and allies throughout the world?
I think to first recognize that there's not as much repair that he thinks. There's not as much damage done as he thinks. I think the relationship with Japan is just about as good as it's ever been. Certainly under Abe, but now under Prime Minister Suga as well. I think that's on a very positive course. I think we succeeded, right, in preventing kind of a perfect storm between President Moon and his political base and President Trump's. I mean, at least in my time there, in South Korea. I think what he could do immediately and easily is improve the damaged relations with European allies. But of course, it's not just about a better atmosphere, at cocktail parties, right? I mean, it's not about the mood music, it's about, hey, what is the alliance for, and how can we work together toward mutually agreed objectives? And I think with the world's largest economies, the EU and Japan in particular, we have to agree on a really solid and relatively detailed agenda to counter Chinese economic aggression and China's efforts to dominate in a way that is unfair the emerging data-driven global economy with data standards, for example, to compete more effectively and to have a joined up approach on internet privacy standards, for example, or to work together on joint technological development and implementation, such as we've seen play out with the infrastructure for fifth generation communications infrastructure. So I mean, I think there's an important and robust agenda that kind of already exists that he could solidify. And Brett, maybe the first action that would show goodwill is to remove steel and aluminum tariffs on our allies. I never got that. I never understood how steel and aluminum tariffs on our allies helped us get to Chinese overcapacity, overproduction, and dumping internationally. Okay, that never made sense. So there's some actions to take immediately. I think there's going to be some wariness on the part of Israel, who I think will see a step back in the alliance. And there's also fear of disengagement from the Middle East broadly, much like the Obama administration announced its intention and did do during the Obama administration. And this is what some called they called it themselves the courageous withdrawal from the Middle East. This leads to hedging behavior. It leads to an open door, for adversaries in the region. So I think there'll be some concern, trepidation, almost, in the Middle East about a Biden administration, that he should allay those concerns. So I think he's pushing on an open door. I think what he maybe soon after coming in, send a thank you note to Xi Jinping for the range of aggressive actions he's taken, and how it's, I think, clarified the nature of the competition to some of our key allies and the need to work together. I think the relationship with India is going to be immensely important. We want India to succeed, right? India is such a big country with big opportunities and big problems, that any problem in India is a problem for the world, right? And these are the interconnected problems associated with climate and environment and energy security and food and water security for India. That ought to be a top priority. I think also talking the BJP leadership and down off of Hindu nationalist policies that could drive really sectarian tensions and potentially conflict, which would be horrible in India. So I think there's a lot of work to do across the board. I could go on about this. I would reassure Australia first off. Maybe that's one of the first places to leaders to call or to go there, because they're getting the full treatment from Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. This is an opportunity to diversify supply chains, to reduce reliance on the Chinese market for those that are subjected to the coercive power of the Chinese Communist Party. So I mean, a lot of work to do, a lot of opportunity though, right? It's not all bad. There are elements of continuity, and there are relations to solidify. I don't know if you saw the leaked European Union document, that just came out recently about the desire to repair the relationship with the U.S. I would use that to our advantage. How about Nord Stream 2? Hey, Germany, how come you're only investing 1% of your GDP in Germany? In defense, not meeting the Wales commitment. Why are you giving Putin coercive power over your energy sector? With Nord Stream 2. So I mean, it's not just about better atmospheric cocktail parties. There's a lot of work to do, and I think there'll be some demands to be made of allies to burden to shoulder their fair share of the burden.
Thank you. Let's turn to Bill Berry. The U.S. policy since at least the Shanghai Communique in 1972 and the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979 has been described as strategic ambiguity. As China has increased its military power, some experts, such as Richard Haas, has argued that the U.S. must be more specific as to what we would do if China threatens to attack Taiwan. What is your perspective? And then I'll go on to the next question, which is also about China. Is Belt and Road a threat to us? If so, what should we do about it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think strategic ambiguity works in two ways. First of all, we want the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and the Chinese Communist Party to have doubts, right, about the willingness to intervene there and to have capabilities there that demonstrate that we could intervene in a way that would deny them the ability to accomplish their objectives in Taiwan by the use of force. But there ought to be a little bit of doubt on the part of the Taiwanese who take responsibility for their own defense. And I think what the Trump administration has done is pretty wise. I mean, and I think by increasing the level of diplomatic engagement, that sends a signal. By making the 6 assurances associated with the Taiwan Relations Act or contemporaneous with that public, I think that was a strong example, a strong message, as have been the arms sales to Taiwan. I think that's sufficient. I don't think we have to go as far as Richard Haas recommended, and wave the red flag, so to speak, in front of the bull, and just really focus on deterrence by denial. Right. This is President Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan is embarked on a very significant and important reform campaign, military reform campaign. We are to support that effort through arms sales and other means, and I think that hopefully will be adequate. But we're in a period of very danger. I read about this in Battlegrounds as the most dangerous flashpoint with China is Taiwan. And the most dangerous period, I think, is between now and the 2022 Communist Party Congress, because Xi Jinping really wants to, in his words, make China whole again before he is then named, ruler for life in the next Mao in 2022. And Belt and Road is a threat in connection with leaving China in control of critical infrastructure. I think what China's goal is to control critical logistics nodes globally, and the communications infrastructure as well, physical and communications infrastructure. And I think, as I mentioned, a way to combat that is to expose it, and to when countries say, hey, don't force us to choose between Washington and Beijing, I think we just say that's not the choice. The choice is a choice between sovereignty and servitude, right? And we ought to be on the side of sovereign countries and sovereignty, and not not want to consign anyone to servitude in connection with this relationship to China.
Thank you. You called Russia a weak country, but it is the only country which can destroy us. The relationship between the two nuclear superpowers are the worst ever. It's even worse than it used to be during the Cold War. Do you think it's time to start talking to Russia diplomatically instead of not effective sanctions, which push Russia towards China?
Yeah. Well, again, I don't think the sanctions are pushing Russia towards China. I think Putin is pushing Russia toward China. I didn't say Russia was weak. I said that Russia doesn't have the strength to compete with us on our own terms economically. Russia, and I read about this in the book, is a grave concern because it has the capability to destroy us and thereby themselves as well in what would be a disastrous nuclear war. Putin has been extraordinarily irresponsible in that connection by developing and boasting about new classes of weapons, including autonomous nuclear undersea weapons, showing in a national address missiles descending at what appeared to be on Mar-a-Lago, Florida, really promulgating a doctrine of escalation domination, in which he threatens European countries with destruction, and then under the belief that the United States won't risk a nuclear holocaust and will give him a seat to peace on Russia's terms. So I think that this is all extremely irresponsible behavior. I think our approach to, for example, Russia's violation of the INF agreement was right. If you're only one party to a two-party agreement is adhering to it, it's a fantasy, like it's not an agreement. But that ought to be, as you allude to, the first step in entering negotiations, arms control negotiations, maybe non-proliferation negotiations. Multi-party would be ideal, with China and others included as well. But we have to recognize that these arms control agreements aren't ends in and of themselves, right? They're a means to an ends and ends of improved security. And so I hope that we follow that. I mean, the tendency has been to, to make concessions after concessions in some of these negotiations, and to portray what are actually, really flawed agreements as successes. Um, just getting them to the table, strategic dialogue and security, I think will be important step, though, and I think the new administration ought to pursue it as a first order of business.
All right, I'd like to circle back to your comments on China and Taiwan. I've got two additional questions, so I'll just discuss both of those. Can you discuss our commitment to protecting Taiwanese interest in relation to China's growing power, and discuss the future of Taiwan given the current threat of China? Also, how strongly worded is the USA agreement, not a real treaty, to defend Taiwan in the event of an attack from China?
Well, it could be strong enough, right? I mean, that's really, I think it just has to be strong enough. And we have, there have been 3 straight crises in the Taiwan Strait, during which we did respond militarily through each of those. And of course, each time that we responded, we demonstrated overwhelming military capability, which spurred China to accelerate their military expansion even more. And so I think we have to recognize that Taiwan is kind of in a race, to develop military capabilities that can allow them to maintain deterrence by denial vis-a-vis China, and that ought to be the approach. I think. I think we don't have to go beyond that. I think that ought to be adequate.
All right, thank you. Next question. What is the current opinion of the military regarding the State Department?
Well, there's no monolithic opinion in the military on anything, right? I mean, but I think that the State Department is in a period of transition, associated with the duress that the department came under Secretary Tillerson initially, who made it a priority to reform the department before really making the assessment of what needed reform, and then the mass retirements of some foreign service officers. I think as the State Department has an opportunity to reinvent itself and to recognize how critical diplomatic engagement is in the critical competitions and challenges that we have to overcome. And I think it's made that shift in some areas. I think in the area of economic competition, the work that Undersecretary Keith Kroc has done, I think, has been immensely important. I hope the new administration carries that forward. And I would just say overall, I think just recognizing that they are critical elements, maybe foundational. They are foundational to our competition between really free and open societies and closed authoritarian systems. And I think that's going to be the defining competition of this century, and obviously our diplomatic efforts will have the lead. One of the things that I've noticed recently is, there's so many calls these days for more diplomacy. And whenever anybody says that, I think just ask for what purpose, right? I mean, because I'm all for it, right? I want, Bill Burns and others who call for it, I agree with them. But I think what oftentimes is missing is, okay, well, to do what? I mean, diplomacy is not an end in and of itself, right? The relationships we develop even are not ends in of themselves. They are means to an ends of advancing our interests, and to recognize that we have to do so in a competitive environment.
Thank you. India is in the grip of their own populism, pandemic, and religious difficulties. Where do they go from here?
Yeah, well, obviously it's up to Indian leadership, but I think as I mentioned, they deserve our full support in this, and we need India to succeed. The world needs India to succeed, and I would make this a major multilateral effort, a partnership with Indian leadership, obviously, with Japan and the EU as well, to agree, on common standards that are critical to economic growth and development. Part of this would be, coaxing India down from its very strong protectionist stances, where that makes sense from an economic perspective. But then from an infrastructure perspective and from an energy security, and as I mentioned, food and water security, about 60,000 people are in severe suffer. Death, premature death from water insecurity issues in India. the Indian administration under President Modi has promised, water, security as a top issue, but about 80% of water use in India is to agriculture. So think about just what adjustments that can be made to agricultural techniques and the savings that could accrue in terms of water and improvements in water security. Of course, that's connected to food security, and of course, India needs to grow, needs to grow to lift a large percentage of its population out of poverty, and to do so, it needs energy security. But it's building coal-fired plants to do that, and there has to be alternatives to that. Cheap renewables, but also natural gas as a bridge to those renewable capabilities, and next generation nuclear and so forth. I mean, there are a lot of issues we can work on together with India. And when I say we, I think it's the U.S., EU, and Japan. That partnership. I think the Quad format is going to be very positive and connect with security cooperation, and that's India, Australia, Japan, and U.S. But this was a big part of our national security strategy in December 2017. Is to prioritize a relationship with India and to work together with India to help India solve its problems, but also for India to remain a positive force in the world as the world's largest democracy.
All right, we have just a few minutes, so I'm going to finish up two questions here. Do we need another national security act so that we can better integrate foreign and domestic security efforts to deal with new conflict domains and actors? And then our last question, Sky has had his hand up for the whole thing, so we're going to let Sky finish up here.
I think an act maybe could be helpful, like as the National Security Act was. As Goldwater Nichols was, for example, and the effect that had on the Defense Department. But I don't think it's necessary. I think what you need is an effective process to affect coordination and integration of efforts across the departments and agencies and of like-minded partners. A lot of that depends on the process you set up, and of course, it depends on personalities and relationships within an administration. This is what I wrote about in terms of the breakdowns that occurred in the decisions that led to an American war in Vietnam. And when I came into the White House, I described in the conclusion my determination to at least not make the same mistakes that McGeorge Bundy, who was one of the principal characters in Dereliction of Duty, that he made, right? And so I think we put a good process in place. I mean, if my successor did not continue it, that was his prerogative, obviously. But I think that I don't think you need big organizational change. Although it could help certain areas. I could go on about this, but I would say, I think there are a number of ways to affect organizational change, right? One is information flow and coordination and integration of efforts in a process. And another is authorities, to change authorities that people have so that they can act more autonomously and be more agile, get more accomplished. And then the third is organizational change. And that third one, it's always hard and contentious and emotional, so I always try to go to the first two first before I go to organizational change as the solution.
All right, Mr. Forster.
All right. Whoops. The General, first I want to just say what a terrific tour de force this has been, and we should all be stunned that you've been able to answer questions about every part of the world and with such great detail and with great sensibility and so on. What I want to do is, you've touched on it. I want to take you back briefly to what I took as the major thesis of your book, which, as I read it, I found myself thinking about E.H. Carr's 20 Years Crisis, you sounding like a realist critiquing all those utopians, but at the end saying it's a blend of both, not just one. And then I also thought of Kenin's containment argument, which was basically about understanding the Soviet Union and understanding Russia and being patient. But at the core of that was a recognition that you talked about as well, which is, and you've talked about in other contexts, is a skepticism about the universal applicability of military force as the instrument of choice. Because of the hubris following Desert Storm that you talk about, and I think rightly so, when you talk about competition, what I read into that is competition, not conflict, and preferably competition not involving the military instrument. Yet in the eyes of so many Americans, when we talk about intervention or responding or competing, we're either thinking about trade wars or we're talking about military wars. So what is your competition, as you thread this needle, what does your competition look like?
Yeah, well, I would say, first of all, Sky, it's transparent competition, right? Transparent competition. And in this case, if you just take China as an example, I think it's important for us to work with like-minded partners to strengthen ourselves, as I mentioned, determine what they perceive as weaknesses into our competitive advantages, and we're not forcing people to choose or countries to choose. We're giving them a choice between sovereignty and servitude, and I think that's the right approach to the China problem set. And I do think that the previous strategy of cooperation and engagement under the belief that China was going to change, the Chinese Communist Party was going to change its fundamental nature, I think we held on to that for too long. And in fact, that policy had us on a path to confrontation because China was emboldened in the South China Sea and elsewhere. So I actually think competition is the best way to avoid confrontation. I think I tell the story about this. I think Battlegrounds. I do it. It was the press conference that President Trump had with Xi Jinping. So President Trump, he recounts some of our main grievances associated with Chinese economic aggression, and then he points to Xi Jinping, says, "Hey," he said, "I don't blame you. I blame us." So I think the corollary to that is to say, hey, don't blame us for competing in our own interests. We're to do so in a transparent, respectful way. I think it's really important these days that Americans reject what I think are the three principal misunderstandings of the competition with China. First of all, that it's a U.S.-China problem. It's not. Okay, I just recounted all these acts of aggression. This is a free world China problem. The second is that there hasn't been any international cooperation. The U.S. is going it alone. It's American first only. That's not true. There's been a very, very high degree of international cooperation. It needs to be scaled up, but there's been some very effective international cooperation. The third, which gets to your question, is that there's this Thucydides trap that poses us with really a dilemma between acquiescence to the party and its designs or disastrous war. And hey, I think there's plenty of competitive space in between those extremes. And the so-called Thucydides trap, I don't buy it. The Communist Party loves it, right? Because they want us to choose acquiescence. And so they say, well, gosh, you're just so insulting to us. And you've been so bullying, and that we're going to force us to a disastrous war. No, it's actually the party's actions that have created this problem, and I think competing is the best way to avoid confrontation. Actually,
General, thank you very much for being with us. We look forward to being able to actually have you back here in Colorado Springs at some point. But we wish you all the best, and thank you for. Really a tremendous tour de force, and I commend the book to everyone who's listening. I put the link, the Amazon link, in the chat box. And
Yes, we
holidays, Karen, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yes, we encourage everybody to please take a look at this book, and the title is Battlegrounds: The Fight to Defend the Free World. So in closing, first let me just say thank you, echo Skies, thank you for your program today. It was tremendous. I think we had a lot of eager interest and great enjoyment. Let me just say in closing, our upcoming programs in partnership with the Colorado Springs Food Rescue and Ormayo Dance, we will offer celebrating worldwide seasonal traditions. No need to get on a plane. You can join us to celebrate the best of international holiday traditions right in your own home. This program will feature a simple yet scrumptious holiday recipe from the Colorado Springs Food Rescue. Colorado Springs World Affairs Council will share fun and unique traditions that ring in the new year around the world. And Ormayo will offer interludes of international holiday dance traditions. This is a free event, but donations are appreciated. And then we resume our speaker series in January on the 14th. This program will be entitled U.S. Foreign Policy Outlook Post-Election. We will be hosting Steve Clemens, editor-at-large at The Hill and former editor-in-chief of Atlantic Live. So for more information on these programs or to join our mailing list, please visit our website at csworldaffairs.org. And again, thank you so much to General McMaster, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Stay well. Thank you so much. Take care.